Chapter 2 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 2. The Reichstag is in flames. Months of intrigue in President Hindenburg's palace had preceded the fall of General Schleicher. Papen's cranking up of industry had come to nothing. The economic difficulties were increasing. At every step, Schleicher stumbled up against obstacles which were created for him through the influence wielded by his predecessor, Papen, over President Hindenburg. From the moment of his own resignation, Papen was working systematically for the overthrow of his opponent, Schleicher. Round Hindenburg there was a number of more or less definite groups fighting each other. But they were not fighting over personal antipathies or sympathies, but over partial interests of sections of the ruling class, the separate interests of politically influential groups. General Kurt von Schleicher had risen from the Reichswehr to the position of Chancellor of the German Reich. The man who announced in his wireless broadcast following his appointment as Chancellor that he was a social general had for 14 years had his hand in the political pie whenever it was necessary to push the political development of the Weimar Republic one step further in the direction of reaction. Schleicher first appeared in November 1918 as the connecting link between the General Staff of the Army and the Social Democratic People's delegates in the beating down of the revolution. The name of the young captain attached to the General Staff appeared in those days linked with the names of Hindenburg, Gruner, and Ebert. He had considerable influence in the newly created Reichswehr. In October 1923, he put through the state of emergency when Ebert handed over all executive power to the Reichswehr General von Seeckt in order to meet the revolutionary menace which resulted from the misery of inflation. Since his youth, Schleicher had been in close communication with Hindenburg and his son, Colonel Oskar von Hindenburg, through his service in the 3rd Guards Regiment and on the General Staff. Schleicher succeeded in becoming a personal informant of Hindenburg. He had the strings in his hands when, in March 1930, Hindenburg threw the Social Democratic Chancellor, Hermann, and with him Social Democracy, out of the government. Schleicher arranged Brüning's fall, when the controlling groups of German capitalism were tending more and more towards the summoning of the National Socialists to power. Schleicher himself took Gruner's place as Minister of the Reichswehr. Even when Papen was Chancellor, Schleicher had already begun to fill the most important posts in the government apparatus with his own reliable men. It was Schleicher who turned the scale when Papen's government was rocking and induced the majority of ministers to deliver the ultimatum that Papen must go. Schleicher had to come more and more into the open, but it was easier to maneuver on the smooth parquet floors of the government offices than to carry out a policy on the precipitous ground of the deepening economic crisis. His short term of office ran out without a program, without a policy, with nothing but vague hints at all kinds of plans. His government was only to serve the most powerful capitalist groups of Germany as a bridge to the fascist attack on the growing revolutionary movement among the workers. In the group closely associated with Hindenburg, there was, in the first place, his son and personal adjutant, Colonel Oskar von Hindenburg. His Secretary of State was Dr. Meissner, who had filled the same position under Ebert. Von Papen, too, after his term as Chancellor, was in Hindenburg's confidential circle. Papen had special support in the Herrenklub, a very influential association of politicians, bankers, big employers and big landowners, high civil servants and officers. Papen had connections with the National Socialists, with Hitler and Göring, with the Stahlhelm, and with the German Nationalist Party under Hugenberg. A few weeks after his fall from office, Papen met Hitler in Cologne at the house of Schröder, the banker. Hitler, who on November 7th had issued a manifesto calling for a fight to the last breath against Papen, in the bankers' drawing room, agreed to the confidential proposals put forward by Papen. From Cologne, Papen went to Dortmund to conduct secret negotiations with Springorum and other representatives of Rhenish-Westphalian heavy industry on the question of the government. Schleicher, too, had close relations with the National Socialists, especially with their socialist wing led by Gregor Strasser. Schleicher attempted to exploit for his purposes the crisis in the National Socialist Party, which was marked by the loss of 2 million voters in the elections of November 6th. He had links with the Social Democratic Leibhardt, president of the German Trade Union General Council, with the Christian trade unions, and with the German Nationalist Commercial Employees Association. He tried to create some kind of trade union mass basis for himself through these cross threads from the trade unions under social democratic leadership to the socialist wing of the National Socialists. At the same time, Schleicher presented the Junkers with millions and millions for relief. Confidential agents carried on negotiations between these groups. Every day new coalitions were being formed and dissolved. Every day the situation changed. Newspapers changed their owners, and their editors changed their political views. A struggle raged for the control of the liberal papers of the Ullstein and Rudolf Masse concerns. The Tägliche Rundschau, once Stresemann's organ, became Schleicher's mouthpiece. There was talk of money which had found its way to the paper from the well-filled chests of the Reichswehr. A new editor was appointed, Hans Zehrer, leader of the so-called Action Group and editor of its journal Action, which carried on a special sort of fascist propaganda with pseudo-revolutionary slogans. Papen tried to secure control of the Berliner Tageblatt. The export industries, the big shipping companies, and the Reich Railways, Siemens, had as their organ the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, which they had been subsidizing for a considerable time. During those weeks, Schleicher also had the backing of Herr Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach and Privy Councillor Duisberg of the IG Farben Industrie, the chemical combine. These were the leading figures in the Reich Union of German industry. Papen had close connections with Springorum and Thyssen, Hugenberg, and the big agrarian interests. All groups were agreed that the National Socialists would have to be drawn in as the political prop for a government of capitalist dictatorship. But there were differences of opinion as to the form and extent of their participation in the government. The intrigues in Hindenburg's palace reflected these differences. The East Prussian relief scandal. Towards the end of January 1933, Schleicher felt that his government was being more and more undermined by the intrigues of Papen and the big agrarian interests associated with him. He felt, too, that he was being pushed out of the circle of Hindenburg's confidential advisers. He therefore decided to have recourse to a defensive maneuver which he had been contemplating for some time. And an immense mass of material appeared in the papers exposing the Osthilfe corruption of the big agrarian Junkers. A commission of inquiry was set up by the Reichstag. The working masses were roused to fury. The scandal threatened to involve even Hindenburg himself. As far back as the time when Hermann Müller was chancellor, the Junkers had received millions through the so-called Osthilfe to put their bankrupt estates onto a paying basis. The small peasants had got practically nothing out of it. The big landowners pocketed the lion's share. In the Reichstag Committee of Inquiry, it was now revealed, at the end of January 1933, that in addition the rich landowners had received many hundreds of thousands of marks to which they were not entitled. An immensely rich owner of 6 manorial estates and a personal friend and neighbor of Hindenburg's had secured 621,000 marks by giving false particulars. 2 counts took 700,000 marks in this way. A certain landowner who had ruined his property on gambling, wine, and women secured 281,000 marks. 2 controllers of offices through which the Osthilfe was distributed paid off their own debts and pocketed tens of thousands in addition. A certain lord of the manor transferred his livestock to his wife in order to secure 154,000 marks of the Osthilfe. Day by day, new names appeared in the list of those who were involved in the Osthilfe scandal, including neighbors of Hindenburg's estate, people who had the run of his house. There was a great uneasiness in the Hindenburg family, for some of the Junkers involved in the scandal were among those who had organized the presentation of the Neudeck estate to Hindenburg on his 80th birthday. No gift tax had been paid on this gift, and the estate had been registered not in Hindenburg's name, but in that of his son, so that the state was also robbed of the future succession duty. The Junkers and industrial magnates had twice collected funds for repairs and equipment for the Neudeck property, and a third time for the purpose of putting it on a paying basis. The mud of the Osthilfe scandal spattered the walls of the president's palace. The Junkers decided Schleicher must go, as they had decided before that Brüning must go. Hitler becomes chancellor. On the morning of January 28th, the Schleicher government resigned, when Hindenburg refused to give authority for the dissolution of the Reichstag. Papen was instructed by Hindenburg to negotiate with Hitler for the formation of a government of national concentration. 2 days of unparalleled tension followed. The Communist Party broadcast leaflets calling for a general strike against the imminent Hitler dictatorship. Schleicher negotiated with Leipart. The struggle behind the scenes grew more acute. On the night of January 29th to 30th, Schleicher was toying with the idea of the immediate proclamation of a military dictatorship and the march of the Potsdam garrison on Berlin. It seemed that a critical situation might develop at any moment. Then Hindenburg decided to appoint Hitler chancellor on conditions. And so it came about that the Hitler-Papen-Hugenberg government was formed on the morning of January 30th, 1933. In June 1932, the Papen-Schleicher government had depended on National Socialist toleration. Goebbels later charged the representatives of the Herrenklub with having adroitly clambered to power over the broad backs of the Nazis. In November 1932, the leader of the National Socialist fraction in the Prussian Diet, Wilhelm Kube, declared that the National Socialists would never march with the battle cry of "with Hugenberg for the stock exchange and capital." But during the following months, Papen had been preparing the National Socialists to throw overboard their thundering declamations as superfluous ballast when Hindenburg gave them the call. The chancellorship fell into Hitler's lap, but not as the fruit of some heroic struggle. January 30th was not the culmination of a national revolution which had conquered power by a bold attack. Adolf Hitler was given the post of chancellor when the leading sections of the ruling class wanted not only to strengthen their power against the working class, but also to smother the smell of the Osthilfe scandal. On the evening of January 30th, the stormtroopers and the Stahlhelm marched with flaming torches along the Wilhelmstrasse, cheering Hindenburg and Hitler. The stormtroop men and the Stahlhelmers knew nothing of what had been going on behind the scenes, and when they acclaimed the day of national awakening, they did not know that corruption and the lust for profit were its godparents. The wave of resistance rises. On January 30th, 1933, the Communist Party made an official proposal to the executive of the Social Democratic Party and to the General Council of the trade unions under Social Democratic leadership, and also the Christian trade unions, that they should jointly organize a general strike for the overthrow of the Hitler government. Social Democracy and the trade unions answered, "Hitler has come to power legally. It was necessary to wait," they said, "until he violated legality. No fight should be put up now. The general attitude of the Social Democratic press was that Hitler would soon be finished with. Considerable sections of the German workers accepted these statements. The Communist Party was unable as yet to bring the majority of the working class into action. The hastily formed Hitler government would have been unable to cope with the united assault of the working class in those first days of February. The Nazi stormtroops had just been passing through a severe crisis, and in some places had lost half their membership. The police apparatus could not yet be relied upon by the new government. It would also have had difficulties with Schleicher's Reichswehr. But the refusal of the general strike gave the Hitler government the time it needed. Nevertheless, the resistance of the workers was growing in Berlin, in Hamburg, in the Ruhr, in the Lower Rhine area, in central Germany, and in all parts of the Reich. The Hitler dictatorship was opposed by a working class whose fighting strength was as yet unbroken. On January 22nd, they had refused to allow themselves to be provoked. Now a wide movement was developing for united action against the raging fascist terror. Social Democratic, Christian, and Communist workers united to defend newspaper and trade union buildings. Hitler could prohibit papers, refuse to allow demonstrations, and send his stormtroops into the working class quarters, but the working class answer was the rise of a wide anti-fascist movement in which all sections were united. The need for a provocative act. Hitler had held power for some weeks, but the situation was far from favorable. The new cabinet had dissolved the Reichstag and ordered new elections. Papen's terrorist decrees were again brought into force in sharpened form, and the Osthilfe scandal was buried in a secret commission. Hitler proclaimed on the wireless his non-existent 4 years plan. But the millions of his voters who were looking forward to German socialism could not be put off merely with a couple of emergency decrees and vague promises. At the end of January, Hitler had been compelled to enter the government on the restricting conditions imposed by Hindenburg. There were many reasons why he was ready to compromise: the discontent among his members and supporters, crisis, and numerous resignations from the National Socialist Party, besides the enormous debts of the party. In bourgeois circles, a number of former Nazi voters had already begun to show a tendency towards the German nationalists. On November 6, 1932, the Communists had won 11 seats in the Reichstag, while Hitler had lost 35. In the new government, there were 3 National Socialist ministers, opposed by 8 representatives of the German nationalists and of the Stahlhelm. There could be no change in the cabinet without Hindenburg's consent. In view of the growing anti-fascist feeling among the workers, Hitler's election prospects were not good. Hugenberg and the German nationalists held all the economic posts of vantage in the cabinet, and masses of the people were beginning to realize that Hitler was carrying out the policy of the worst firebrands among the capitalists. The disillusionment of the masses would show itself in an increased communist vote on March 5th. It had become an imperative necessity for the National Socialist leaders to change the situation by an act of provocation planned on a grandiose scale. Then the elections could be carried out while the pogrom feeling against the Communists and Social Democrats was at its height. At the same time, the position of the National Socialists within the cabinet could be strengthened. Goebbels provided the plans for the most outrageous of all the acts of provocation which a ruling class has ever used against the insurgent working class. Goering, president of the Reichstag and commander of the Prussian police, was responsible for the exact fulfillment of the plan. The original plans of the National Socialist leaders to bring all stormtroopers to Berlin for the night of March 5th to 6th had been shattered by the threat of their allies to bring out the Reichswehr against them. But the new plan of provocation provided the means to satisfy the National Socialist demand for complete governmental power and also to prepare the way for an unrestrained Nazi terror. The National Socialist leaders moved into action. The German nationalist police president of Berlin, Dr. Melcher, was transferred to Magdeburg, and his place in Berlin was filled by the National Socialist retired Admiral von Levetzow. On February 24th, the Karl Liebknecht House, the headquarters of the German Communist Party, was once again searched by the police. Although the Karl Liebknecht House had already been in the possession of the police for some weeks, and was only left by the police after a thorough search which produced no results, now suddenly seriously incriminating material was found. The day before the Reichstag fire, gigantic headlines in the whole bourgeois press told readers of the secrets of Karl Liebknecht House, of subterranean passages, treasonable material, and plans for a Bolshevistic revolution. The press also reported an alleged communist bomb outrage on the railway in East Prussia. This outrage was never mentioned again. On January 25th, there was a small fire in the Berliner Schloss, which was announced sensationally as a communist act. In this way, public opinion was carefully prepared, from paper to paper, from day to day, for the great coup. The Communist Party received reliable reports that the government had planned an act of provocation. The deputy Wilhelm Pieck spoke of it in the Sportpalast in Berlin. He mentioned a Nazi plan for a faked attempt to assassinate Hitler or some other act of provocation, which was to take place some days before the election and lead to the prohibition of the Communist Party. The Communist fraction in the Reichstag made a similar statement at a conference of foreign press representatives. The Hitler press, following instructions, raised the campaign against the revolutionary workers to boiling point. Everyone who was following the political situation realized that a crisis was imminent. Everyone felt that there was something in the air. Then, on the night of February 27th to 28th, all German wireless stations broadcast the message, "The Reichstag is in flames." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 3. Van der Lubbe, the Tool. Marinus van der Lubbe was born in Leiden on January 13, 1909. His father owned a small shop and also traded his wares through the neighboring villages. At the age of 16, after a short period as assistant in a shop, Marinus van der Lubbe became a worker in the building trade, which he had to leave after an accident which permanently injured his eyesight. Shortly before this, he joined the Leiden branch of the Young Communist League. He was always ambitious and seeking prominence, and in January 1929 he resigned from the Young Communist League because he was not appointed leader of the Pioneers organization. He rejoined, but in December 1929 again resigned, owing to a conflict with the Young Communist League in connection with leaflets which he wrote and distributed over his own signature. He joined the League again in 1930, but was distrusted and did not take any active part. In April 1931, the question of his expulsion was raised, and van der Lubbe immediately resigned. From that date, he had no connection whatever with the Young Communist League or Communist Party, but attacked the Communists whenever he had the opportunity. Van der Lubbe's life. Marinus van der Lubbe was 5 months in the Leiden hospital after his accident. He could not go back to his trade and tried to earn his living in various ways. In the winter of 1927-28, he worked as a temporary waiter in the station restaurant in Leiden, and in the summer of 1928 he was a porter in the Van Holland Hotel at Noordwijk. After that he did a little trading in potatoes on his own account, and then worked on a ferry transporting building materials between Nordwijk and Sassenheim. In the summer of 1930 he went to Calais, and on his return stated that he had worked as an excavator and had also made some attempts to swim the Channel. We have made detailed inquiries in Calais, but can find no evidence that he ever made such an attempt. But the fact that he boasted of this on his return to Leiden is characteristic of his outlook. Enquiries into his life in Leiden have definitely established the fact that he was homosexual. This is of great importance for his later history. His tour through Europe. Together with a friend of his, Holverda, he planned a workers' sports and study tour through Europe, and had cards printed with his and Holverda's photographs and the statement in 4 languages that they were undertaking a tour through Europe and the Soviet Union. Before they left, there was a quarrel, and Holverda remained in Leiden. Actually, the postcards say that the tour was to begin on April 14th, 1931. We have in our possession one of these cards, dated from Potsdam, April 14th, 1931. Not long after, van der Lubbe was back in Leiden. He makes Dr. Bell's acquaintance. When van der Lubbe returned from his first short visit to Germany, he told his friends of a gentleman who had taken him on a long tour in his car. We do not know whether Lubbe's story was true, or whether he invented the gentleman from Leipzig. But we do know that on that first visit to Germany, van der Lubbe made the acquaintance of a man who played a decisive part in Lubbe's future life. In April or May 1931, Lubbe met Dr. Bell. We know this from a friend of Dr. Bell's. He writes, "If I remember rightly, it was in May 1931 that Bell told me he had made the acquaintance of a young Dutch worker who had made a very good impression on him. He must have met him when he was out in his car, near Berlin or Potsdam. They met a hiker on the way and gave him a lift in the car. He was a young Dutch workman. This young Dutchman later visited Bell in Munich. Bell called him Renus or Renus. He had frequent meetings with him." Marinus van der Lubbe visits Munich. In September 1931, van der Lubbe again started out for Germany. He still had the postcards which he had had printed for his tour through Europe, and sold them on his way. At the frontier village of Gronau in Westphalia in September 1931, he was arrested for selling cards in the street without a license. The court in Münster imposed a small fine. At Bacharach on the Rhine, van der Lubbe got into conversation with a motorcyclist. He was also a Dutchman, Plucht, a railway engine driver whose home was in The Hague, Bloemfonteinstraat 24. Plucht gave Lubbe a lift in his sidecar, and they put up overnight in Rothenburg. Plucht at the hotel, and Lubbe at a youth hostel. Plucht told our investigator of the conversation he had had with van der Lubbe, who, in reply to the question what he was doing in Germany, said that he was looking for work. Plucht then asked van der Lubbe whether he would not be much more likely to find work in Holland than in Germany, to which Lubbe replied with great assurance that he would get work in Germany. Plucht recalls that he was surprised at van der Lubbe's tone of assurance. From Rothenburg the two went on to Munich, parting on the outskirts of the town. We know that van der Lubbe visited Dr. Bell in Munich. We do not know exactly how long he stayed there, but it must have been some days, as on his return to Leiden he gave his friends a detailed and accurate description of the town. He talked not only of the town, but also of the grand time he had had there, and of the many gentlemen whose acquaintance he had made there. The most important acquaintance made by van der Lubbe in Munich was Captain Röhm. At that time Dr. Bell was still advisor in foreign politics to Hitler's chief of staff, Röhm. He was a close friend of Röhm's, so close, in fact, that Röhm gave him the confidential task of establishing connections with the Reichsbanner commander, Major Meyer. Röhm then felt that he was being persecuted by the National Socialist murder gang, and he tried to get protection from Meyer through the intermediary Dr. Bell. All these facts were established in court in October 1932, when Captain Röhm brought an action against the Social Democratic journal Münchener Post. Bell was not only advisor in foreign politics to Röhm, he was also his confidant in personal matters. The Münchener Post and other papers in 1932 published letters from Röhm to young men, from which it is clear that Röhm was homosexual. Dr. Bell knew many of Röhm's relations with young men, for the reason that he himself procured many of them for Röhm. Bell, who had intimate knowledge of the situation within the National Socialist Party, kept a list of these young men, intending to use it as a weapon against Röhm if any conflict developed with him. Van der Lubbe's name was on this list. A voyage of adventure. After leaving Munich, van der Lubbe did actually carry out part of his tour through Europe. We are in possession of a postcard written by him from Krakow. Our investigator in Holland saw a letter which he had written from Budapest and a card from Belgrade. When van der Lubbe returned to Leiden in January or February 1932, he had a great deal to tell his friends about his tour. One of these tales deserves to be told. Van der Lubbe said that he had been in Poland and had reached the frontier of the Soviet Union. A mighty river, he said, divides Poland from the Soviet Union. He had tried to swim this river, but was driven back by shots from the Polish frontier guards. He was then arrested and kept a few days in a prison from which he could see the Soviet frontier across the river. Then he was sent about his business. Van der Lubbe's friends were greatly astonished when our investigator informed them that there was no mighty river between Poland and the Soviet Union. This tale again is characteristic of van der Lubbe's boastfulness and desire for notoriety. The cards and letters which van der Lubbe had written to his friends in Leiden are proof that at the end of 1931 and the beginning of 1932 he was in several towns in Hungary, Poland, and Yugoslavia. It is probable that he was not alone, but in the company of some rich man. On his return to Leiden, he said that a gentleman in Budapest had given him new shoes, that the Dutch consul in Yugoslavia had given him his fare back, and other improbable things which suggest that he actually traveled with some rich friend. Dr. Bell introduced Lubbe not only to Captain Röhm, but to other National Socialists as well. From then on, he was in regular communication with National Socialist circles. His friends in Leiden are unanimous in their statements that Lubbe received many letters from Germany and that he always tried to conceal these letters from his friends. A guest of the Nazis. Van der Lubbe's return to Leiden in January or February 1932 was unexpectedly prompt. He sent a postcard from Berlin and arrived at Leiden at the same time as the card. He must therefore have traveled by train or by car. The question of where the money came from remains open. After an interval of about 2 months, van der Lubbe went on a third visit to Germany. But before that he achieved a little notoriety in Leiden, smashing some windows at the office of the relief organization which had refused to increase his allowance. He was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment for this. Before going to prison, however, he managed to pay another visit to Germany. We know that he went to Berlin and Saxony. On June 1st and 2nd he stayed the night at Czernowitz, where he was seen in company with the local councillor Sommer and also Schumann, who owned a vegetable garden. Both are National Socialists. After the Reichstag fire, Councillor Sommer reported van der Lubbe's visit in June 1932 to the mayor of Brockwitz. This fact was recorded in a protocol which was forwarded to the Saxon Ministry of the Interior, which notified Frick, Reich Minister of the Interior, of these facts. The facts became public as a result of an interpellation in the Saxon Diet by a Social Democratic deputy. They have not been denied by anyone. The papers which reported this interpellation also reported that Councillor Sommer had disappeared a short time after he had made the report concerning van der Lubbe's stay at Czernowitz. This statement, too, has not been contradicted. After his stay in Czernowitz, van der Lubbe must have remained in Germany a few days longer. On his return to Holland, he was arrested in Utrecht on June 21st, 1932. He was 9 days in prison in Utrecht and was then moved to the prison at Schravenhage, Hague, to carry out his 3 months sentence. Van der Lubbe attacks the Communist Party. Van der Lubbe was released from prison on October 2nd, 1932. He came from The Hague to Leiden and did not go out of the country again before the end of the year. He paid a visit to his father at Dordrecht, and then went on to Amsterdam and The Hague. In these towns he spoke at a number of meetings, his speeches vigorously attacking the Communist Party. We have definite evidence of this. One document in our possession shows that van der Lubbe spoke at a fascist meeting for the fascists. A second document describes van der Lubbe's attitude at a meeting of taxi drivers who were on strike at The Hague. At this meeting, van der Lubbe not only attacked the communists, but tried to incite the taxi drivers to terrorist acts. Van der Lubbe followed a consistent line since he finally left the Communist Party. From 1929 to 1931, he had been trying to find scope for his anarchist tendencies within the communist movement. And when his connections with it were finally broken in April 1931, he turned to attacking the movement. This attack became more and more vigorous at every meeting he addressed. The arguments which he was using during the last quarter of 1932 were clearly influenced by National Socialist propaganda. Lower middle class in origin, and only temporarily in the ranks of the workers, he had returned to the fold. His last journey to Germany. In January 1933, van der Lubbe was making preparations for another visit to Germany. Before he left, he had to have treatment for his eyes again at the Leiden hospital, and he was 4 weeks in hospital. Shortly before his departure for Germany, he visited Frau van Zijp, in whose house he had lodged. She told our investigator of her last talk with van der Lubbe, who told her that his passport had very nearly run out. She asked him whether it was really necessary for him to go to Germany, and whether he would not do better to stay in Leiden. Van der Lubbe replied that she need not worry, he had something important to do in Germany. He would only need his passport for this occasion, and then it would not matter if it ran out. In the middle of February, Marinus van der Lubbe left Leiden. Before his departure, he had a new suit and new shoes. The Vossische Zeitung of March 2nd reported that he spent the night at Glindau, near Werder, on February 17th, and that he went on to Berlin on February 18th. In Berlin, he met the Nazi friends whose acquaintance he had made through Dr. Bell. Van der Lubbe, the Tool. On February 27th, van der Lubbe was arrested in the burning Reichstag. The flames were the background of the hoax in which van der Lubbe for a few hours played the leading role. Then he passed from the stage. The searchlights of truth have pierced the fog of deception and mercilessly shown up Göring and Goebbels, who made use of van der Lubbe as their tool. Why did the murderer Heines and his associates, who had been entrusted by Göring and Goebbels with the technical carrying out of the incendiary act, choose van der Lubbe as the tool? Van der Lubbe had been in the communist movement in Holland up to April 1931. The men who were carrying out the orders issued by Goering and Goebbels believed that this was enough to make it possible to put the guilt for the incendiary act in the Reichstag onto the shoulders of the communists. Van der Lubbe's homosexual connections with National Socialist leaders and his material dependence on them made him obedient and willing to carry out the incendiary's part. Van der Lubbe's Dutch nationality was a further advantage. It enabled Goering and Goebbels to represent the burning of the Reichstag as an international plot. For all these reasons, van der Lubbe was chosen as the tool to carry out the incendiary act. The leading figures in the plot were Dr. Goebbels, concocted the plot for setting fire to the Reichstag, also the fanatical lies and provocation. Captain Goering, a drug fiend, directed operations. Edmund Heines, a murderer, was entrusted with the leadership of the incendiary group. Marinus van der Lubbe, the tool. When the Chicago police in 1886 staged a bomb explosion carried out by paid provocators, an explosion which killed a large number of the police, it was 7 years before the act of provocation was established. The tools had been well chosen. After the burning of the Reichstag, it took only 3 days to make the whole world certain that the National Socialists had set fire to the Reichstag. The tool van der Lubbe was too ill chosen. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio, interfaceaudio.com. Brown Book of Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 4, Part 1. Chapter 4. The Real Incendiaries. The German Reichstag. The foundation stone of the German Reichstag was laid by Wilhelm I on June 9, 1884. The building was completed in December 1894. The German Reichstag building is in the Königsplatz, opposite the Bismarck Memorial. The east front faces the Friedrich-Ebert-Strasse. The south front overlooks the Tiergarten, across the Simonstrasse, while the north front overlooks the Spree. The building consists of cellars, a ground floor, a main floor, an intermediate floor, and 2 upper floors. The front of the building is 137 meters long. It is crowned by a large dome, round which are 4 smaller cupolas. The central feature of the main floor is the session hall, in which the Reichstag met. The walls of the chamber are paneled in wood, except for the side behind the president's chair, which is stone. The dais, the tribunes, and the deputy seats are of wood. The seats are arranged in the form of an amphitheater in 7 sections, divided by narrow, thickly carpeted gangways. There is a corridor running round the hall, which leads into the lobby. The corridors and the hall are furnished with carpets, upholstered seats, and heavy curtains. In the main floor there are also numerous rooms and halls, with windows looking out over the streets. The reading room, the archives, and the library are partly on the main floor and partly in the intermediate floor. The heating and ventilating apparatus is in the cellars. A small flight of stairs leads from the cellar to a subterranean passage, which leads out under the portico of the Reichstag and under the Friedrich-Ebert-Strasse. A door shuts off this subterranean passage from the stairs and also from the other rooms containing the ventilation apparatus. Hot pipes run along the walls of the passage. The main entrance of the Reichstag opens on the Königsplatz, but this entrance is only used on special occasions. How does a visitor get access to the Reichstag? In all its reports on the burning of the Reichstag, the Hitler government gave no indication of how the incendiaries got into the Reichstag. They replied on the fact that practically no German or foreigner knows the formalities which have to be gone through in order to enter the Reichstag. The following shows what a visitor to the Reichstag has to do to get in. 1. Non-members and visitors can only enter the Reichstag through door 2 or door 5. Door 2 opens onto the Simonstrasse, door 5 onto the Reichstagschufer. 2. Anyone entering the Reichstag through door 5 comes into a lobby across which there is a rope barrier. The officials stand behind this barrier. 3. Each visitor has to apply to one of the officials. It is impossible to get into the Reichstag without giving particulars to an official. Each visitor has to fill in a printed card with the name of the visitor, the name of the member whom he wishes to see, and the reason for the visit. 4. This card is then taken by a messenger to the member concerned. The member is asked whether he is willing to see the visitor. 5. While the messenger is looking for the member, the visitor has to wait in the waiting room. He is all the time under observation by the officials on duty. 6. If the member agrees to see the visitor, the latter is then brought to him by a messenger. The messenger conducts the visitor personally to the member and only leaves when the visitor is with the member. 7. All visitors are listed in a special register, which is made up from the cards already mentioned. The fire in the Reichstag. Between 9 and 9:15 in the evening of February 27, 1933, fire broke out in the Reichstag building. The first public announcement of the burning of the Reichstag was made that evening by wireless. The Berlin broadcasting station also announced that the incendiary was a Dutch communist named van der Lubbe. He was said to have made a full confession and to have been caught in the building, dressed only in a pair of trousers, when the police officials came to the Reichstag. It was stated that he had a Dutch passport on him and also a membership book of the Dutch Communist Party. Early the following morning, the official Pressedienst circulated the following account of the fire. On Monday evening, fire broke out in the German Reichstag. The Reich Commissioner for the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, Minister Göring, immediately on his arrival took over the direction of all operations. As soon as the fire became known, Chancellor Adolf Hitler and Vice-Chancellor von Papen also came to the Reichstag. This is undoubtedly the most serious act of incendiarism as yet experienced in Germany. The police investigation has shown that the fire was started at a number of points all over the Reichstag building, from the cellar to the dome. Tar and torches were used, these being put in leather chairs and among the documents of the Reichstag. Also near doors, curtains, wood paneling, and at other easily inflammable spots. A police official saw persons with burning torches in the dark building. He fired at once. One of the criminals was caught. This is the 24-year-old bricklayer van der Lubbe of Leiden in Holland, who had on him a Dutch passport, which was in order, and stated that he was a member of the Dutch Communist Party. The central portion of the Reichstag has been completely burnt out. The sessions chamber with the tribunes and corridors have been destroyed. The damage runs into millions. This act of incendiarism is the most monstrous act of terrorism so far carried out by Bolshevism in Germany. Among the 100 centners of material which the police discovered in the search of the Karl Liebknecht house, there were instructions for the carrying through of the communist terror on the Bolshevist model. According to these instructions, government buildings, museums, mansions, and essential plant were to be burnt down. The directions also state that in disturbances and conflicts with the police, women and children should be sent in front of the terrorist groups, where possible the wives of the children of police officials. The systematic carrying through of the Bolshevist revolution has been checked by the discovery of this material. In spite of this, the burning of the Reichstag was to be the signal for a bloody insurrection and civil war. Plans had been prepared for looting on a large scale in Berlin at 4 a.m. on Tuesday. It has been ascertained that today was to have seen throughout Germany terrorist acts against individual persons, against private property, and against the life and limb of the peaceful population, and also the beginning of general civil war. The Reich Commissioner of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, Minister Goering, has taken the strongest measures to meet this terrible danger. He will maintain the authority of the state in all circumstances, and with all the means at his disposal. It can be stated that the first attack of the criminal forces has been beaten back for the moment. Already on Monday evening, all public buildings and vital industries were placed under police protection to ensure public security. Special police cars are passing continuously through the parts of town which are chiefly threatened. The whole of the police and criminal police in Prussia has immediately been put in a state of readiness. The auxiliary police have been called up. Orders have been issued for the arrest of 2 leading communist members of the Reichstag on a charge of grave suspicion. The other Communist Party members of the Reichstag and officials have been put under protective arrest. Communist papers, periodicals, leaflets and posters have been prohibited throughout Prussia for 4 weeks. All social democratic newspapers have been prohibited for 14 days, as the Reichstag incendiary in his confession admitted that he had connections with the Social Democratic Party. Through this confession, the United Communist Social Democratic Front has become a palpable fact. This situation demands of the authorities responsible for the security in Prussia decisive action to fulfill their duty of maintaining the authority of the state in this moment of danger. The latest events have fully established the necessity of the special measures which had already been introduced: auxiliary police, authority to the police to shoot, etc. These measures equip the state power to nip in the bud any further attack on the peace of Germany, and thereby on the peace of Europe. Minister Goering appeals for the strictest discipline from the German nation in this grave hour. He expects the unwavering support of the population, for whose security and safety he answers with his own person. The first press announcements. On the morning of February 28th, millions of people read the accounts of the burning of the Reichstag in their papers. The front pages shouted in great letters, "The German Reichstag in flames." This event overshadowed all other news. In London, Paris, New York, Amsterdam, Prague, and Vienna, the reader was furnished with long accounts of the burning of the Reichstag building. The reporters unanimously stated that the hall had been completely burnt out, including the dome above it, the glass roof being shattered, and the struts bent. The corridors round the Reichstag chamber and the lobby were also destroyed. The press of the world, however, contained a number of divergent statements with regard to the further details. The Prager Tagblatt of February 28th stated that the fire was noticed at about 10 o'clock in the evening. The Temps of March 1st stated that the fire had been discovered at 9:15 p.m. The London Times of February 28th reported that the fire had broken out at 9 p.m. The reports in the papers also gave different accounts of how the fire had been discovered. The Hugenberg news agency, Telegrafen Union, stated in an announcement which was printed by a section of the press in the morning edition of February 28th. It has been established beyond question that the fire was developed into a conflagration with the aid of torches placed at various points. A police official noticed through one of the windows a man carrying torches moving stealthily and immediately fired at him. The Temps of March 1st states, on the other hand, that the first warning of the fire was given by an employee of the Engineering Institute opposite the Reichstag. The number of points at which the fire started is estimated differently by the various papers. The Prager Tageblatt of February 28th speaks of 20 points, while the Berlin correspondent of The Times states in the issue of February 28th that the police officers on duty told him that the fire had started in 4 or 5 places. The Chicago Tribune reports 10 points. The rapidity with which the fire spread shows conclusively that it was started at a number of points. The pogrom against the left begins. The fire in the Reichstag was still burning when police cars and motorcyclists and the Nazi storm detachments were already on their way. The first arrest was made immediately after midnight. By the morning, police headquarters were filled with hundreds of arrested persons who sat on long benches in the corridors. Communists, socialists, pacifists, writers, doctors, and lawyers had been torn from their beds in the night and taken to police headquarters. Many of them were already asleep when the wireless announcement of the fire was circulated. The noon papers gave the first names of the arrested persons. Among them were writers Ludwig Renn, Egon Erwin Kisch, Erich Baron, Karl von Ossietzky, and Otto Lehmann Russbild, the doctors Bonheim, Schminke, and Hoden, the lawyers Apfel, Litten, Barbach, and Felix Hall, the communist members of the Reichstag Walter Stecker, Ernest Schneider, Fritz Emmerich, Ottoman Geschke, and Willi Caspar. The Reichstag member Torgler, who was accused of being jointly responsible for the burning of the Reichstag, on the morning of February 28th, went to police headquarters to make a protest against the charge. He was arrested. The Communist and Social Democratic press did not appear on the morning of February 28th. The printing works of the Vorwärts and of the papers Berlin am Morgen and Welt am Abend were occupied during the night of the 27th, and the copies of the morning edition, which had already been run off, were confiscated. The printing works of the Rote Fawn, which are in the Karl Liebknecht house, had been occupied by the police some days previously, and the Rote Fawn had already been prohibited before the burning of the Reichstag. Emergency decrees. The fire in the Reichstag was put out during the night. Within a few hours, the President of the Reichstag signed a decree entitled Emergency Decree for the Protection of the Nation and the State. It contained the following clauses. In virtue of Article 48 of the Constitution of the Reich, and as it measures of defense against communist acts of violence which endanger the state, it is decreed 1. Articles 114, 115, 117, 118, 123, 124, and 153 of the Constitution of the German Reich are suspended until further notice. Consequently, restrictions on personal freedom and on the right of free expression of opinion, including the freedom of the press and of the right of association and assembly, are permissible beyond the limit laid down in these articles of the Constitution. In addition, the privacy of correspondence, of the post, telegraph, and telephone is suspended, and house searchings and the confiscation or restriction on the rights of property are permissible. 4. Any person who opposes any orders issued by the state authorities or officials authorized by them for the enforcement of this decree, or orders issued by the Reich government in accordance with Section 2, or who supports or incites to such opposition, is liable to imprisonment for not less than 1 month, or to a fine from 150 to 15,000 Reichsmarks, unless a heavier penalty is imposed under existing legislation. Any person whose opposition endangers life is liable to not less than 6 months' hard labor, in extenuating circumstances, and if the opposition has fatal results, to the death penalty, or in extenuating circumstances to not less than 2 years' penal servitude. Any person who incites to opposition to the public danger is liable to hard labor, or in extenuating circumstances to imprisonment, for not less than 3 months. 5. The death penalty is substituted for penal servitude for life, where this is laid down under the Criminal Code, namely under Sections 81, high treason, 229, poisoning, 307, arson, 311, causing explosions, 312, causing floods, 315, damage to railways, 324, attempts to poison groups of persons. The following crimes are punishable with death, or unless heavier penalties are imposed by previous legislation, with penal servitude for life or up to 15 years. 1. Any attempt to murder the President or ministers or commissioners, whether of the Reich or of the States of the Reich, or instigation to such murder, or agreement or conspiracy with others aiming at such murder. In cases under Section 115 of the Criminal Code, serious rioting, or Sections 125, serious breaches of the peace, any act involving the use of arms or conscious and deliberate cooperation with armed persons. 3. Any act to deprive any person of his or her liberty, with a view of using him or her as a hostage in political conflicts. The campaign. Special editions of the papers, ministerial speeches, wireless announcements and posters everywhere announced. The Communists have set fire to the Reichstag. Insurrection and civil war were to follow. The Communists intended to violate your wives and murder your children. The Communists intended to poison the water in the wells and the food in the restaurants and canteens. Every hour crimes of the Communists were hammered into the readers of the German papers and those who listened to the wireless. The campaign was developed on a systematic plan. The press was crammed with atrocity stories of what the Communists had intended. The Vossische Zeitung of March 1st gave information which it had from government sources. The government is of the opinion that the situation is such that a danger to the state and to the nation existed and still exists. The material from the Karl Liebknecht House is now being examined by the government's legal advisers. Official reports state that this material contains proof that terrorist acts had been systematically prepared by the Communists on a scale that would place the nation and the state in the greatest danger. Among the confiscated Communist material, definite plans have been found for the seizure of hostages, especially the wives and children of particular individuals, plans for incendiary acts on public buildings, directions for terrorist groups who were to be placed at certain points in the uniform of the police. Storm detachments and Stahlhelm. There is, it is declared, well-founded suspicion that the Communist activities are to be continued and that the central leadership of their operations will, if necessary, be removed from Berlin. There is also good cause to believe that, as in Karl Liebknecht House, there are subterranean cellars and passages at other points, through which the Communists escape at the moment of danger. In this connection, it is emphasized that the necessary steps have been taken at the German frontiers to make the flight of suspected persons into foreign countries impossible. In connection with the act of incendiarism in the Reichstag, it is stated that irrefutable proof exists that the chairman of the Communist section in the Reichstag, Deputy Torgler, had been for some hours in the Reichstag building with the incendiary, and that he had also been with others who had been concerned in the crime. It is added that the other criminals may have been able to escape through the subterranean passages, which, in connection with the heating arrangement of the Reichstag, link the Reichstag building itself with the building occupied by the President of the Reichstag. In this connection, reference is made to the arrest of two persons who telephoned from the Reichstag building, asserting that the President of the Reichstag, Goering, was the instigator of the incendiary act, and stress is laid on the fact that the people concerned were connected with the Social Democratic Party and press. The authorities state that the fight against communism will now be conducted with extreme severity. Anyone who works with the Communists, or regarding whom there are sufficient grounds to suspect that he is working with them, will be rigorously dealt with as the Communists themselves. The government statements also make it clear that the elections will be held under all circumstances. Quote, "It is to be noted that the decrees for the protection of the nation and the state, and the decree which punishes high treason more severely than hitherto, are supplementary to each other. The authorities state that the clauses of the decree for the protection of the nation and the state, which are particularly directed against communism, were necessary because of the documents found in Karl Liebknecht House. Thus, for example, the increased severity of the punishments laid down in the criminal code for the administering of poison and poisoning to the common danger has been due to the fact that the Communists intended to carry out acts of poisoning on a large scale, including the poisoning of food in restaurants frequented by politicians who were their enemies. Minister Goering spoke on the wireless on March 1st, and this was relayed from all German stations. According to the unanimous reports published in the press, Goering made the following statements in his speech. The Communists are using leaflets and handbills to rally workers capable of using arms for red mass self-defense. This pretext was to enable the masses of the revolutionary Communists to be mobilized and to bring them into battle against the nation and the state. I should like to state openly that we are not carrying on a defensive fight, but that we have passed to the offensive along the whole front. It will be my principal task to extirpate communism from our people. For that reason, we have also mobilized those forces of national Germany whose main task it must be to overcome communism. On February 15th, it was ascertained that the Communist Party was engaged in organizing terrorist troops in units up to 200 men. These groups were to dress in storm detachment uniforms and then to carry out attacks on motor cars, stores, shops, etc. Similar attacks were to be carried out on allied associations, such as the Stahlhelm and the national parties. By these means it was hoped to break the unity of the national movement. Terrorist troops in the uniform of the Stahlhelm were also to carry out similar activities. In cases of arrest, false particulars were to be given. In addition, numerous forged orders of the Storm Detachment and Stahlhelm leaders were found in which the Storm Detachments were directed secretly to hold themselves in readiness for the night of March 6th in order to occupy Berlin, and they were to be prepared to use their arms and beat down all resistance, etc. These forged orders were then to be circulated to the authorities and among the citizens in order to create the fear of a National Socialist push and to throw the workers into the necessary state of confusion. There were also forged police orders instructing the police to hand over armored cars. At a meeting of the Communist Party executive on February 18th, there was discussion of what was expressly called a pact of attack of the united proletariat against the bourgeoisie and against the fascist state. On the same day, the leader of a group which was intended to blow up bridges, who had fallen under suspicion owing to a considerable quantity of explosives being missing, was arrested. A short time afterwards, an organization of the Communist Party was discovered, which was to work with poison. A poison plan was discovered in Cologne, which made it clear that the poison was to be used in the food of the storm detachments and of the Stahlhelms. A further document proves that not only the wives and children of leading individuals were to be taken as hostages, but also the wives and children of police officials, who were to be put in front of demonstrations as a living wall of defense. The leadership of this murder organization was in the hands of the communist leader Munzenberg. On February 22nd, the Central Committee issued the slogan of the arming of the working class. The instructions state, "In the application of the terror, every means and every weapon must be employed." Mass strikes were organized. Solidarity strikes were to be prepared. All persons able to use arms were to report, and all members were to prepare themselves for illegality. Goering then spoke of an organization plan for the armed insurrection, entitled The Art of Armed Insurrection. He stated that this armed insurrection was the first phase of civil war. Instructions were said to be given in it for the use of small terrorist groups, and for the starting of fires in the thousands and thousands of places. The aim of these activities was said to be to entice the police and the Reichswehr into the country, and then to start the insurrection in the unprotected towns. In making use of hostages, no humanitarian motives should be allowed to intervene. Goering's concluding words were, "Let me tell the Communists, My nerves have never given way up to now, and I feel strong enough to repay their criminal activities in kind." Who were the incendiaries? From the moment when the news was spread of the burning of the Reichstag, the question was raised throughout the press of the world. Who were the incendiaries? Most of the German papers adopted the statement of the Hitler government that the Communists had set fire to the Reichstag. The whole of the foreign press, however, received the official information with considerable skepticism, which soon developed into open ridicule of the official count of the temps of March 1st, containing the following statement: "The official communiqué is obviously intended to rouse the population to fury against the left opposition. There is no way of testing the police statements. It can only be said that the burning of the Reichstag comes very opportunely for the government election propaganda. It serves as prelude to action, not only against the Communists, but also against the Social Democrats, and also serves the purpose of enabling the Nazi storm detachments and the Stahlhelm to come out as an armed force." In the same edition of the Temps, it is said that the democratic circles and circles of the left in Berlin are skeptical regarding the origin of the Reichstag fire. In the issue of the following day, the Temps further states, "The arrest of van der Lubbe and his accomplices is not sufficient to lift the veil which covers the Reichstag fire." The London News Chronicle of March 1st declared, "The suggestion that the German Communists had any official connection with the affair is just nonsense." The London Evening Standard of March 1st, 1933 stated, "It cannot be disputed that there are millions of people in Germany today who simply cannot and will not believe the extraordinary stories circulated officially about the Red Revolution, which has only just been averted. Nor is the official version of the setting alight of the Reichstag by a Dutch communist implicitly believed by many people. These few examples of the many press reports suffice to show that no credence was given outside Germany to the official declarations of the Hitler government. The whole world outside Germany was and is convinced that the National Socialists set fire to the Reichstag." We will give one more quotation, which brings out the view of the outside world with particular clarity. The leading article in the Daily Telegraph of March 2nd contains the following: "Van der Lubbe's examination will perhaps explain how he smuggled in his supplies of benzene, and whether he worked alone or as one of the 10, who are reported by the Nazis to have had a hand in the job. As to this it may well be asked, first, where are the 9 others? And secondly, where were the lynx-eyed Reichstag watchmen?" Within 3 days of the Reichstag fire, the Hitler government was confronted with the fact that no one abroad gave any credence to its reports. Who benefited from the Reichstag fire? Every criminal investigator first puts the question, who derived any advantage from the crime? And this question must be put in connection with the Reichstag fire. The Hitler government asserted in its official report of February 28th that the Reichstag fire had been organized by Communists, and that it was to have been the signal for a bloody insurrection and civil war. But is there, apart from the government's assertion, a single shred of evidence that on the night of February 27th the Communist Party intended to resort to bloody insurrection? The Communist Party's tactics are definitely at variance with such a suggestion. On March 25, 1933, the German Communist Party issued a statement on the burning of the Reichstag, which contains the following: "Anyone who has even the slightest knowledge of communism, of the teaching of Marx and Lenin, of the decisions of the Communist International, and of the German Communist Party, knows that the methods of individual terror, arson, acts of sabotage, and so forth, do not belong to the tactical methods of the communist movement. The Communist Party has always stated that its aim was carrying through of the proletarian revolution. In order to achieve this aim, the party uses the tactics of revolutionary mass struggle, the winning of the masses for the communist movement, through agitation and propaganda, and above all, through the organizations of the daily struggle for the immediate interest of the workers. These are the tactics through which the communist movement, on the basis of Marxist and Leninist principles, realizes its aim in every country. It is obvious that the Reichstag fire could have no imaginable sense or purpose for the communist movement. Could setting fire to the Reichstag bring any advantages to the communists? The German Communist Party had been increasing its influence steadily during the preceding years. In the presidential elections of March 1932, it secured 4,960,000 votes for its candidate, Ernst Thälmann. In the Reichstag elections of July 31, 1932, it secured, in round figures, 5,300,000 votes. In the elections of November 6, 1932, it reached 6 million votes. The Communist Party entered the campaign for the election of March 5, 1933, with exceedingly good prospects. The whole foreign press prophesied a great increase in the Communist vote. The dissatisfaction in the Social Democratic ranks was growing. Repeated acts of provocation by the Nazis, the ejection of the Social Democratic ministers in Prussia by an officer and 3 men, the passivity of the trade union and party leaders, all contributed to driving wide sections of former Social Democratic voters into supporting the Communists. There was equal dissatisfaction in the ranks of the National Socialists. In the November election of 1932, Hitler had lost over 2 million votes. The process of disintegration was developing. When Hitler came to power, many of his adherents expected a decisive change for the better. It did not come. There was a danger of still further secession into the ranks of the Communists. The Hitler government included among the evidence of what the Communists had in mind the pamphlet, The Art of Insurrection. The Bayerische Courier, the organ of the Catholic Bavarian People's Party, in its issue of March 3, 1933, referred to the fact that this pamphlet dated from 1923, and the pamphlet contains the following quotations from Lenin. One must make sure first that all the class forces hostile to us have fallen into complete enough confusion and are sufficiently at loggerheads with each other, have sufficiently weakened themselves in a struggle beyond their capacities to give us a chance of victory. Secondly, one must ensure that all the vacillating, wavering, unstable intermediate elements, the petty bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeois democracy, in contradistinction to the bourgeoisie, have sufficiently exposed themselves in the eyes of the people, and have disgraced themselves through their material bankruptcy. Thirdly, one must have the feeling of the masses in favor of supporting the most determined, unselfishly resolute, revolutionary action against the bourgeoisie. Then, indeed, revolution is ripe. Then, indeed, if we have correctly gauged all the conditions briefly outlined above, and if we have chosen the moment rightly, our victory is assured. With the vanguard alone, victory is impossible. It would not only be foolish but criminal to throw the vanguard into the final struggle, so long as the whole class, the general mass, has not taken up a position either of direct support of the vanguard or at least of benevolent neutrality towards it. Had Goering even glanced at the pamphlet, he would not have made the mistake of citing it as evidence against the Communist Party. Hitler as Hugenberg's prisoner. On January 30, 1933, the so-called Government of National Concentration was formed with Hitler as chancellor. The terms on which the Hindenburg appointed Hitler were extremely hard for the National Socialists. German nationalist ministers had the absolute majority in the cabinet. The vice-chancellor, von Papen, was appointed commissioner for Prussia, although in previous governments this post had been filled by the Reich Chancellor himself. The Ministry of the Reichswehr, which the National Socialists had claimed in the last stage of the struggle for power, was entrusted to General von Blomberg, a loyal supporter of Hindenburg. When the new cabinet took the oath on January 30th, Hitler had to give an express undertaking, in the presence of all the members of the cabinet, that he would not alter the composition of the government, whatever the result of the election might be. The three National Socialist ministers, Hitler, Frick, and Göring, took their places in a government of German nationalists, who controlled all the economic ministries, besides the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of the Reichswehr. According to the plans of the German nationalists, Hitler was to be their prisoner. He was received by Hindenburg only in the presence of von Papen. There was no precedent for such treatment to a chancellor. No change could be made in this situation by legal methods. The German nationalists were very pleased with themselves. The second leader in command of the Stahlhelm, Lieutenant Colonel Duesterberg, in an election meeting on February 12th, made known to the public the fact of Hitler's undertaking not to make any change in the cabinet. The men round Hitler, especially Goebbels and Göring, did all they could to free Hitler from the embrace of the German nationalists. Only a changed distribution of power within the government could damp down the growing dissatisfaction of many National Socialist electors. An attempt at a putsch was too dangerous. The Reichswehr and the Stahlhelm were with Hindenburg. If it came to fighting, it was likely that the Reichsbanner would side with the Reichswehr, and the Stahlhelm against the Nazis. Dr. Oberfohren's Memorandum. It was in this situation that the National Socialists entered the election campaign. Dr. Goebbels, the most ingenious of the National Socialist leaders, saw how things threatened to develop. It was he who first thought of a grand coup, which would at one blow change the political position of the National Socialists. Evidence of the origin and carrying through of this coup exists. On April 26 and 27, 1933, the Manchester Guardian published articles on the Reichstag fire, in which reference was made to a memorandum originating in German nationalist circles. This memorandum was produced by the former chairman of the German nationalist fraction in the Reichstag, Dr. Oberfohren. When it became known that Dr. Oberfohren was the author of the memorandum referred to in articles published in the Manchester Guardian, the attack on him began, and on May 7th he was found dead in his flat. The report issued by the Hitler government stated that he had committed suicide. In reality, he had been murdered by the Nazis. After the March 5th elections, Dr. Oberfohren had attempted to organize the fight of the German nationalists and the Stahlhelm against the Nazis. As a confidant of Hugenberg's, he was fully informed of all that went on in the cabinet. He set down in a memorandum what he knew of the preparations for the burning of the Reichstag, and sent this memorandum to his friends. We quote from this memorandum only the most important passages, which indicate what was taking place behind the scenes during February. After stating that the repeated searches of Karl Liebknecht House had produced no results, Dr. Oberfohren gives an account of how the plan for the burning of the Reichstag was developed by the National Socialists. Dr. Goebbels' plan. Herr Dr. Goebbels, untroubled by any scruples, had soon prepared a plan which, if carried out, would not only overcome the opposition of the German nationalists to the Nazi demands for the suppression of social democratic and communist agitation, but in certain circumstances, if completely successful, would also secure the prohibition of the Communist Party. Goebbels considered it necessary that material should be found in Karl Liebknecht House, which would prove the criminal intentions of the Communists, and establish that a Communist insurrection was imminent, and that therefore there was immediate danger in delay. As Melcher's police, Melcher was the police president of Berlin, had still found nothing in Karl Liebknecht House, a new police president for Berlin must be appointed from the National Socialist ranks. It was only with great reluctance that Herr von Papen allowed his nominee, Melcher, to be displaced. The National Socialist nomination of Count Helldorf, head of the Berlin storm troops, was not accepted. Finally, agreement was reached on Admiral von Levetzow, who, although he belonged to the National Socialist Party, also still had connections with the German nationalists. It was a simple matter to smuggle material into the Karl Liebknecht house, which was then empty. The police had the plans of the office section and the cellars. The necessary documents could therefore be easily put there. From the first, Goebbels was clear as to the necessity of underlining the seriousness and the credibility of the forged documents, on their discovery by some incident, even if this was only hinted at. Provision was in fact made for this. On February 24th, the police forced their way into the Karl Liebknecht house, which had been standing empty for some weeks, searched it thoroughly, and sealed it up. That same day, the official announcement was made that a quantity of extremely treasonable material had been found. On February 26, the Conti Bureau, the government's news bureau, issued a very detailed account of what the result of the search had been. It is not worth while to repeat this statement, the penny dreadful style of which struck even the most unprejudiced reader. A detailed account was given of secret passages, secret springs, secret tunnels, catacombs, subterranean vaults, and other contrivances of similar character. The whole content of the report produced a ridiculous effect, as, for example, the descriptions of the cellars of an office building in the fantastic terms subterranean vaults and catacombs. It was remarkable that in what were described as well-concealed rooms in the cellar, the police should find several hundredweight of precise directions for the carrying through of an imminent revolution. The statement that what had been found in these secret vaults was proof that the Communist Party and its auxiliary organizations lived a second illegal existence below the surface was particularly nonsensical. Admiral von Levitzow, police president of Berlin, on the afternoon of Sunday, February 26th, made a report to the Minister of the Interior, Herr Göring, on what had been found in the Karl Liebknecht house. The discoveries in the Karl Liebknecht house gave rise to considerable dissension within the coalition government. Papen, Hugenberg, and Seldte vigorously reproached Herr Göring for making use of such a swindle. They pointed out that the documents alleged to have been discovered were such clumsy forgeries that they could in no circumstances be produced in public. They pointed out that it should have been managed more skillfully, along lines similar to those used by the English conservatives some time previously in connection with the forged Zinevaev letter. The crudeness of the description of the Karl Liebknecht house given by the Conti Bureau was emphasized. German nationalists and Stahlhelmers pointed out that no one would believe that the Communists would have deliberately established their illegal headquarters in Karl Liebknecht house. The forgeries should have been carried out less clumsily, and the illegal rooms should have been discovered in some other quarter of Berlin. Nevertheless, as the whole affair had already been made public, the German nationalists could do nothing but agree to further strengthening of the decrees against the Communists on the basis of the material that had been discovered. Of course, they were in no way concerned to protect the Communists, but merely objected to the crudeness of the methods used. At the same time, they also wanted to allow the Communists, in any event, to take part in the elections, as they wanted to prevent the National Socialists from securing the absolute majority in the Reichstag through the elimination of the Communist Party. End of Section 5, Chapter 4.